Old blood and guts, that's what they called him. But whose blood? Whose guts? The soldiers who served under General George S. Patton said that phrase told the whole truth, it was their blood and his guts. This is the story of what it truly meant to fight under the most feared and ferocious commander in American military history, told from the foxholes, the freezing trenches, and the shattered hospitals where his men paid the price of his greatness. The man behind the myth. He stood before them like something conjured from an old war painting, polished boots that caught the light, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at each hip, a face cut from granite, and eyes that seemed to be permanently fixed on some distant enemy only he could see. General George Smith Patton Jr. was not merely a commander. He was a force of nature, a contradiction made flesh, a man who wept at ancient battlefields and slapped crying soldiers in hospitals. He was, in the words of one of his own officers, the most magnificent son of a bitch who ever drew breath. The soldiers who served under him would carry two contradictory truths for the rest of their lives: that fighting under Patton was the most terrifying, exhausting, and dehumanizing experience they had ever endured, and that it was also the reason they were alive to tell the story. This is not a tale of medals and monuments. This is the story of what it felt like, in the mud and cold and dark, to be one of Patton's men. George Patton was born in 1885 into a family with deep military roots, Virginia Military Institute graduates, Confederate officers, warriors across generations. From boyhood, Patton was consumed by a single ambition: to be a great general. He read Caesar in the original Latin, studied Napoleon's campaigns obsessively, and genuinely believed he had lived previous lives as a soldier, as a Carthaginian mercenary, as one of Napoleon's marshals, as a Roman legionnaire walking these same blood-soaked fields of Europe. He told people this without embarrassment. He believed it completely. He graduated from West Point, competed in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, finishing fifth, and spent the interwar years consumed by a single question: how does armor win a war? By 1941, he had assembled more knowledge about tank warfare than almost any officer in the American Army. He was also, by nearly every account, the most difficult human being any of them had ever encountered. Patton demanded perfection in appearance, perfection in discipline, and perfection in aggression. He believed that a soldier who looked sloppy thought sloppy and fought sloppy. He personally fined soldiers for failing to wear their neckties in combat zones. He issued orders that every man in his command must be clean-shaven, even in the field, even under fire. He once reportedly reduced a full colonel to tears for having dirty fingernails. These were not eccentricities. In Patton's mind, they were the difference between life and death, between an army that wins and an army that collapses. But the deeper truth, the truth his soldiers came to understand slowly, painfully, was that beneath the theater, beneath the pearl-handled pistols and the swagger, Patton was a student of war unlike any other. He could look at a map and see what was going to happen before it happened. He could feel the shape of a battle the way a musician feels the shape of a melody. And he would spend the lives of his men to realize that vision, because he believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who thinks he has done this before, across multiple lifetimes, that the fastest path through the battle was the only moral path. War is not about dying for your country, Patton told his men. It's about making the other poor dumb bastard die for his. His soldiers laughed. They always laughed. And then they went and did exactly what he asked. North Africa, learning to follow the hurricane. The American Army of 1942 was, by most professional assessments, not yet an army. It was a collection of civilians in uniform who had been handed weapons and told to fight the most experienced, most professional military machine in the world. The results, initially, were catastrophic. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces tore through American lines with contemptuous ease. American soldiers retreated, abandoned equipment, broke and ran. II Corps was, in the quiet judgment of the Allied High Command, a humiliation. Eisenhower replaced the Corps commander with Patton. Patton arrived at II Corps headquarters like a force of weather. Within hours, the entire command knew something had changed. He issued written orders: every soldier would wear his helmet at all times. Every vehicle would be properly maintained. Every officer would be present at his post. Infractions would result in immediate fines, $50 for officers, $25 for enlisted men, amounts that represented weeks of pay. He drove through the command in his jeep, stopping soldiers personally, dressing down officers in front of their men, radiating an energy that was simultaneously terrifying and galvanizing. Private James McNamara, serving with II Corps, later recalled, "We hated him the day he arrived. Within a week, we were afraid not to fight. Within a month, we understood that his kind of fear was better than the other kind." The other kind was the fear of the German guns. The fear that had broken them at Kasserine. Patton understood, with his unusual combination of battlefield instinct and historical knowledge, that the cure for one fear was another, fiercer fear. If his soldiers were more afraid of him than they were of the Germans, they would advance. And if they advanced, some of them would die, but far fewer than if they froze, or broke, or retreated. The Battle of El Geta in March 1943 was the first proof. 2 corps, transformed in 11 days, held its ground against Rommel's veteran forces and counterattacked. It was the first significant American victory against German armor in the war. The soldiers who survived it knew they had crossed some threshold, that they had become, under Patton's brutal tutelage, something approaching real soldiers. But the cost was not trivial. Patton drove them without mercy. He drove them through exhaustion, through heat, through supply shortages, through casualties that would have caused other commanders to pause and consolidate. He believed, and his subsequent campaigns would vindicate the belief, that momentum was armor. That speed was survival. That the army which stopped to rest was the army which gave the enemy time to prepare. His soldiers were tired, always. They were hungry, often. They were frightened, always. And they were, under his command, victorious. Sicily, the race and the scandal. The Allied invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943 was Patton's greatest triumph and his worst humiliation, often within days of each other. Patton commanded the 7th Army. His assignment was to protect the flank of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army as Montgomery made the main drive northward. It was, in Patton's estimation, an insult. He was to be the support act while a British general took the glory. He seethed. Then, characteristically, he found a way around it. Exploiting an ambiguity in his orders, Patton sent his forces racing west and north, bypassing his assigned role and driving toward the Sicilian city of Palermo. He captured it in 4 days. He then turned east, racing along the northern coast of Sicily toward Messina, the prize that Montgomery was also racing for from the south. Patton's army reached Messina first. He was the first Allied commander to reach the goal of the campaign, and he had done it by refusing to accept the role assigned to him. His soldiers paid for that speed. They marched in brutal heat, sleeping only in snatched hours, pushing through mountain passes under artillery fire, covering distances that professional soldiers considered impossible. Medical officers reported rates of exhaustion and heat casualties that alarmed Army headquarters. Patton was unmoved. He believed the suffering was the point, not to be cruel, but because suffering at pace was survivable, while the casualties of a slow, methodical campaign were not. "A pint of sweat will save a gallon of blood," he told his officers. He meant it mathematically. He believed it was true. And the numbers, across his campaigns, suggest he was right. But Sicily also brought the scandal that nearly ended him. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital. Moving through the ward, he came upon Private Charles Cole, who sat slumped on a stool with no visible physical injury. When Patton asked what he suffered from, Cole replied, quietly, "I guess I just can't take it." Something broke in Patton. He slapped the soldier across the face with his glove, kicked him, and ordered him sent back to the front. Cole, it turned out, had a temperature of 102 degrees and was later diagnosed with malaria and dysentery. A week later, at a different hospital, he did it again, slapping Private Paul Bennett, who had been diagnosed with combat fatigue, threatening to have him shot for cowardice. Word spread quickly, as words in armies always do. Reporters who had witnessed the August 10 incident debated what to do. 4 of them, from the Saturday Evening Post, NBC, Newsweek, and CBS, ultimately agreed to suppress the story at Eisenhower's personal request, on the grounds that Patton was too valuable to lose. But journalist Drew Pearson broke the story on his national radio program in November, and the reaction was volcanic. Congress demanded Patton's dismissal. Newspapers across the country condemned him. The public, which had been fed a diet of heroism and sacrifice, recoiled at the image of a general slapping a wounded soldier. Eisenhower, furious, forced Patton to apologize to both men, to the medical staff who had witnessed the incidents, and to every division in his command. Patton, who had never apologized to anyone in his life, did it, grinding through the speeches with what soldiers described as barely concealed agony. Among his men, opinions were divided. Some were appalled. Many more, perhaps the majority, understood, or believed they understood, what Patton had been trying to do. They had seen soldiers in their own units who had given up, who had found in the diagnosis of battle fatigue a way out of the front line. They knew the thin line between collapse and malingering. They did not excuse what Patton had done. but they understood the frustration that had driven it. Private First Class Robert Longley, who served in the 7th Army and witnessed the atmosphere after the scandal, said decades later, "We were angry at him. But we never stopped being proud of him. That's the strangest thing, you can be angry at a man and proud of him at the same time." Patton made us feel that way a lot. Exile and the greatest deception of the war. After Sicily, Patton was sidelined. While the Allied armies prepared for the greatest amphibious assault in history, the invasion of France, Patton sat in his headquarters, stripped of command, waiting, fuming, drinking heavily of the bitter wine of irrelevance. But Eisenhower had not discarded him. He had found a use for him that was, in its way, more important than any battlefield command. Operation Fortitude was the Allied deception plan designed to convince Germany that the D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The deception required a credible threat, an army large enough, commanded by a general feared enough, to convince German intelligence that this was the real invasion force. The Germans, who assessed Patton as the most dangerous commander in the Allied order of battle, were the perfect audience. A fake army, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, was assembled on paper, with convincing radio traffic, dummy equipment visible from aerial reconnaissance, and a command structure just real enough to be believable. At its head, General George S. Patton. The Germans were convinced. They kept their best armored reserves away from Normandy for critical weeks after the June 6 landing, waiting for the real invasion that Patton's FUSAG would launch at Calais. Those weeks gave the Allied beachhead time to consolidate, to build up enough strength that it could not be pushed back into the sea. Patton's value to the Allied cause, during the months when he commanded nothing real, may have exceeded his value during any of his actual battlefield campaigns. He did not know this at the time. He knew only that other men were fighting and dying in France while he sat in England, pretending to command an army that did not exist. The journals from this period are among the most anguished he ever wrote. He spoke of shame. He spoke of irrelevance. He spoke of the certainty that he was going to be left out of the war he had prepared his entire life to fight. Then, on July 28, 1944, 52 days after D-Day, he received his orders. The Third Army was going to war. The lightning war across France. Patton took command of the Third Army in Normandy on August 1, 1944. What followed was one of the most extraordinary military performances of the 20th century. The Third Army's breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, shattered the German defensive line and sent American armor racing across France at a pace that stunned even the most optimistic Allied planners. Patton drove his forces east, then southeast, then every direction that opened before them, capturing ground, cutting off German units, encircling enemy armies in a style of warfare that looked, to astonished observers, less like a grinding Allied advance and more like a German blitzkrieg. For his soldiers, the summer of 1944 was a blur of speed and violence. They moved so fast that supply lines struggled to keep up. Trucks drove day and night, headlights blazing, carrying fuel and ammunition to columns that were already 100 miles ahead of where the maps said they should be. Soldiers slept in their vehicles, ate when they could, fought without pause. Private First Class Eddie Walsh, serving with the 3rd Army's 4th Armored Division, later recalled the experience. "We never stopped. I used to fall asleep standing up, leaning against a tank. I'd wake up and would already be moving again. You lost track of days. You lost track of towns. Everything was just the next objective, the next road, the next fight." Patton understood something that most commanders of his era did not fully grasp. The enemy's fear was as potent a weapon as any gun. An enemy who knows that you are fast, aggressive, and relentless, who has watched your forces materialize in places they should not logically be, begins to hesitate. And in war, hesitation is defeat. The Third Army's speed was not merely an operational achievement. It was a psychological weapon. Between August 1, 1944, and the end of the war, the Third Army was in continuous combat for 281 days. It crossed 24 major rivers, captured more than 12,000 cities and towns, and by the final accounting, had killed, wounded, or captured nearly 1.8 million German soldiers, 6 times its own strength in personnel. These numbers are almost incomprehensible. They represent the aggregate of individual acts of courage, desperation, fear, and violence committed by hundreds of thousands of ordinary men doing extraordinary things because their commander willed it to be so. But the cost was real. Third Army casualties were significant. Patton's philosophy, that speed saves lives overall even as it costs lives in individual engagements, was not a comfortable abstraction for the men who were lost. Their families would not have found much comfort in the arithmetic. And yet, the soldiers who survived, and the majority of them did survive, in a war where survival was never assured, tended, in retrospect, to see it the way Patton saw it. That going fast was going safe. That stopping was dying slowly. That the general who was called cruel was, by his own brutal logic, the most merciful of them all. The Battle of the Bulge, the miracle that wasn't. December 16, 1944. Hitler launched his last great offensive in the West. 3 German armies crashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. In the chaos of the first days, American units were surrounded, overrun, and shattered. The most serious crisis in the Western Allied campaign was suddenly, terrifyingly real. At the center of the bulge, in the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of several armored divisions found themselves surrounded by German forces far superior in tanks and artillery. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defense, received a German demand for surrender and replied with a single word, nuts. But defiant as it was, that single word was not going to hold Bastogne. The paratroopers were running out of ammunition. They were running out of food. They were wounded, frostbitten, and fighting in conditions of cold and darkness that tested the limits of human endurance. They needed someone to come for them. They needed it soon. On December 19, 1944, at a crisis conference with Eisenhower, Patton made a promise that stunned every senior officer in the room. He had already, he said, issued preliminary orders to 3 divisions. He was prepared to attack northward toward Bastogne in 48 hours. When Eisenhower expressed skepticism, turning an entire army of 250,000 men in winter conditions, in a matter of days, was considered tactically impossible, Patton said only, "I am going to do it." What he did not say, because saying it would have sounded like boasting, was that he had been watching the German build-up for weeks. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, had warned him. Patton had quietly prepared 3 different attack plans against 3 different contingencies. When the bulge broke, he already had his orders written. He needed only to choose which plan to execute. The Third Army began its turn northward. In conditions that military historians have compared to some of the worst operational challenges in military history, blizzard-level snow, temperatures far below freezing, roads clogged with retreating troops and abandoned vehicles, no air support due to solid cloud cover, Patton's army pivoted like a machine. It was, in McAuliffe's later and somewhat grudging assessment, a remarkable task to accomplish. For the soldiers doing the pivoting, it was simply hell. Sergeant Michael Connolly of the 4th Armored Division remembered the approach to Bastogne. "We drove through the night. The snow was so deep the tanks were plowing it. You couldn't see where the road ended and the fields began. The men in the tanks couldn't feel their hands. We lost vehicles to ditches, to ice, to German artillery we couldn't see and couldn't hear until it was already landing. We kept going because Patton said keep going, and because somewhere ahead of us there were men who were going to die if we didn't." On December 26, 1944, Christmas Day already gone, Bastogne still encircled, a spearhead of the 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines. The siege was lifted. The men of the 101st, hollow-eyed with exhaustion, watched their rescuers arrive and simply wept. Patton, who had driven from his headquarters to be present, walked through the liberated town with tears freezing on his face. He later wrote in his diary that it was one of the 2 greatest days of his life. He did not record the other. The cost had been severe. The 4th Armored Division, which led the relief, had been burning through men and machines for weeks before the bulge even started. By the time Bastogne was relieved, its companies were at a fraction of their nominal strength. Men who had been fighting since Normandy were fighting still, without adequate rest, without replacement of their losses, in conditions that their bodies were not designed to survive. Patton knew this. He drove them anyway. He drove them because the men in Bastogne were dying, and because in Patton's mathematics, the suffering of exhausted men was preferable to the death of surrounded ones. He drove them because he believed, and subsequent history has vindicated him, that he was right. Blood and faith, the paradox of Patton. There was another Patton, visible mostly in letters and diaries, that the public rarely saw. A man who knelt in a Luxembourg city chapel on Christmas Eve, 1944, and prayed, earnestly, specifically, with the focused sincerity of a man who believed completely in the God he was addressing, for clear weather so his men could fight. A man who wept openly at cemeteries. A man who wrote to his wife about the faces of his dead soldiers and the weight that never left him. Patton ordered his chaplain to write a prayer for good weather and had it distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. When the clouds broke on December 23 and Allied air power was finally able to support the Bulge offensive, Patton telephoned the chaplain personally. "Padre, you fixed the weather, he said. Give God a medal. He was a man who cursed with legendary fluency and prayed with equal conviction, who believed in reincarnation while attending church every Sunday, who kept a copy of the Bible and a copy of Rummel's tactical manual on his desk and considered both essential reading. He was a man who despised cowardice with a fury that sometimes crossed into cruelty and who wrote, in private, about the unbearable weight of sending men to die. His soldiers saw flashes of this other Patton. They saw him appear at field hospitals to award Purple Hearts to men who could barely open their eyes. They saw him stop his convoy to talk to exhausted infantrymen and ask about their food, their equipment, their mail from home. They saw him, on Christmas Day, 1944, traveling from unit to unit to ensure that every soldier in the Third Army had a hot turkey dinner, a logistical achievement that, in the conditions prevailing at the time, was arguably more difficult than some of his tactical maneuvers. Private Sam Goldstein, serving with a supply unit in the Third Army, recalled, "He showed up at our position on Christmas night. Just showed up, in his jeep, in the dark. He talked to each man. Asked about his family. Told us what we were doing mattered. I had cursed his name 100 times. But that night, I would have followed him into hell." Many of them did. The men who survived, what they carried home. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The Third Army had been fighting continuously since August 1944. Its men came home carrying experiences that defied easy narration, the sounds, the smells, the images that would surface in nightmares for decades, the weight of having survived when others had not. They came home carrying something else too, a complicated relationship with the man who had commanded them. Few of them would claim to have loved Patton in any simple sense. He had driven them too hard for love. He had been too frightening, too demanding, too relentlessly present in his expectations for love. But many of them, perhaps most, came to a kind of respect that was deeper than love. The respect you give a force of nature. The respect that comes from having been pushed past what you thought were your limits and discovering that your limits were further out than you had known. Staff Sergeant Howard Katz, who fought with the Third Army from Normandy to the Czech border, said it this way: "Patton was never wrong about the war. He was sometimes wrong about people, about what a person could take, about the difference between fear and cowardice. But about the war? About what it took to win? He was never wrong. And because he was never wrong about that, we are alive to say he was wrong about the rest." Patton himself did not survive long into the peace. On December 9, 1945, his staff car was struck by a military truck near Mannheim, Germany. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died on December 21, 1945, the same season in which he had won his greatest victory 1 year before. He was buried, at his own request, among his men, in the Luxembourg American Cemetery, alongside thousands of soldiers of the Third Army. His grave is the most visited in the cemetery. People who were born long after the war he won come to stand before it and try to understand the man beneath the legend. The legend says, blood and guts. The men who served under him would tell you it was more complicated than that. That the blood was real, theirs, mostly, and the guts were real, mostly his, sometimes theirs, and that somewhere in the brutal arithmetic of war, the combination produced something that looked, from a certain angle, like salvation. He was all blood and guts. He was the general his soldiers loved to hate and hated to love. He was the man who slapped a soldier and broke through to Bastogne. He was the most frightening figure most of them had ever stood before and the only man who could have led them through. He was, in the end, General George S. Patton, and whatever else he was, he won.